Streaming live from the Paul and Catherine Ranke Memorial Studio, this is TV Free Baltimore. Support for TV Free Baltimore comes from viewers like you. Become a TV Free Baltimore member by visiting patreon.com/TV Free Baltimore.
You're watching Maryland Politics here on TV Free Baltimore.
According to a Gallup poll taken in June, confidence in media has hit a new low. Only 11% of those surveyed have confidence in television news. If you're like me, you haven't watched the mainstream media news in years or read the Sun paper in decades. So where can those of us who live in Maryland find informative information about what's going on around us? Well, I found a good source of information concerning politics and popular culture. It's the Maryland Muckraker. This evening we have the man behind the Maryland Muckraker, Ethan Reese. Ethan, welcome to TV Free Baltimore. Before we go any further, tell our viewers where they can find the Maryland Muckraker.
On Facebook at Maryland Muckraker, or if you just search it in any popular search engine, it should pop right up and you can subscribe to our email list.
Tell our viewers why they should tune in to the Maryland Muckraker for informative information.
That's a good question. I would like to think that, I do think that it's really the only conservative opinion journalism source in the entire state of Maryland. I think that there's not a single other media entity or even just individual blogger that kind of represents the, call it a pro-Trump, grassroots conservative movement style of opinion journalism.
I would imagine that you and I are at least a generation apart, maybe even in a little bit more. And I remember a time, believe it or not, when CNN was actually a good news outlet, and it would come on late at night. They were truthful and gave you the facts, and it gave you information, and let you make your own mind up concerning things. But as far as your generation, what's been your experience with the mainstream media?
I would admit to you that I've interacted with it only a little bit. I mean, I will flip on CNN or even Fox News occasionally. I mean, there are a couple commentators that I like on Fox News that I'll tune into, but I admittedly get my news elsewhere altogether. So I guess I'm 31 years old now, so I guess I would count as the generation that kind of, one of the early, like the first generations to miss the quote-unquote mainstream news as it was currently or previously constructed. I'm a big news consumer, so it's not like I don't have the appetite for it, but I just think it's just never really interested me more than anything, to be honest with you. I just kind of came up during I was in college when Facebook and Twitter and everything kind of became a big thing. I remember like blogs were really big as I was coming up and kind of growing into wanting to consume news. Things like Gawker, blogs like that, Breitbart, Drudge Report were the sorts of news sources that just kind of resonated with me for one reason or another. So I kind of have basically missed the mainstream media as it was. I do consume a lot of, call it legacy local journalism. I'm really interested in, what's happening locally more so even than what's happening nationally. So I do read a bunch of the Baltimore Sun, the Carroll County Times, the Baltimore Banner, individual blogs and things of that nature that cover local politics and local stories. So I have interacted with those much more than the CNNs and the Foxes and the ABCs of the world.
Even talking about local media, do you see a liberal bias in the reporting of, let's say, the Sun?
I definitely do. I could actually share a quick anecdote. I was recently at a Dan Cox rally in Carroll County, and the Baltimore Banner was there. There was an individual reporter. I won't name her. She was very pleasant. We got along great. Had a great conversation. But as I was introducing myself, I said, hey, I'm Ethan. I do this, podunk blog called the Maryland Muckraker. Like, we probably have the opposite political point of view. And she kind of jumped in and was like, oh, well, the Baltimore Banner is nonpartisan. And I kind of gave her a curious look, like, nonpartisan? What do you mean? And she goes, well, we don't endorse any candidates. And I just kind of started thinking to myself, like, well, not endorsing any candidates doesn't mean it's not a nonpartisan outlet. And just for fun, I kind of pulled up the Baltimore Banner on my phone a couple hours later, and 2 of their top 4 stories, I remember, like, one was kind of a commentary piece where the individual, again, a Banner reporter, a Banner news columnist, was describing how she thought that she was brave because she was the only individual on an airplane wearing a mask. I'm kind of paraphrasing the story, but it was basically that kind of story. And then the one below that was where women could go to get abortions, basically, which they framed as like healthcare access. And I was like, I appreciate that you don't endorse candidates. I guess there is something to be said for that. But to think of yourself as not a nonpartisan outlet, just given the story selection, and of course, that's not to say anything about the ownership structure, right? I mean, we know Stuart Bainham was a Democrat state delegate back in the, I think it was mid 80s, late 70s. A big time donor to the Clintons and to the Obamas. So I think the banner, it's probably fair to say, suffers from the same sort of lack of self-awareness. I think it's fair to say as CNN, where they kind of tell you, hey, we're like the neutral arbiters of truth, we're the news, we give you the facts, when in reality they have a particular point of view. I think what you'll get with me, and of course my output is infinitesimal compared to what they can do, but I think what you'll get with me is, and I put this at the bottom of every single article, fearlessly conservative commentary. Like, I just come right out and tell you that I have a conservative point of view, and that obviously paints the stories that I write and how I write them. I just acknowledge it. Where the CNNs of the world, and in this case the Baltimore Banner, unfortunately, who I am honestly rooting for and am a paying subscriber of, just don't seem to have either the same awareness or the willingness to just pronounce it.
Funny you used the term self-awareness, and one of the reasons I reached out to you to bring you into our studio was that you did a video about the biased questioning of the Baltimore Sun to political candidates. You want to touch on that for a minute?
I think the question was, how can local government reduce discrimination in terms of distributing government contracts? And I just thought that was and that might not be the exact wording of the question, I don't have it in front of me, but the same premise was baked into the question, which was that local government services, the way they issue contracts, was racially discriminatory. So the way that they pose the question, they bake a premise that is obviously a progressive left-leaning premise, and one that I would consider to be just abjectly and obviously false. I mean, if you talk about the way that local governments, state governments, especially in the state of Maryland, the way they distribute their contracts, I mean, your sex, your race, your zip code of your business, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that get factored into who gets the contracts and who doesn't. So if anything, it leans the complete opposite way. But I took very specific issue with the way the question was posed, because they built in a premise that was, again, one that I believe is false. And not many candidates, right? I mean, if you're a national politician, right, you're used to being in front of a camera, you're used to kind of dealing with this, but a lot of politicians, especially in Carroll County, these are like people that have spent 40 years in the school system and then want to help out, and so they run for office. Or they've run a construction company for 30 years and now they're done and they want to try something else and they want to be a commissioner. And they don't really have I don't want to call it the awareness, but they just don't really know how to identify a false premise in a question and then reject it. So the Baltimore Sun is basically setting all of these candidates up for failure. And I believe, if you want to talk about discrimination, that to me is a discriminatory practice against conservative politicians. Now, of course, nobody's obligated to fill out this Baltimore Sun questionnaire, but if you're going to paint yourself as being the neutral arbiter and the neutral source of news, I think you've got to ask questions that are posed neutrally, which in this case, demonstrably was not the case.
Ethan, what is a Maryland Muckraker story? What is the focus of your publication?
First, I'm flattered that my hobby blog, could be considered a publication, but I'll take that as a gold star. I just try to write the content that I want to read that doesn't seem to exist. I'm interested in local politics. I'm interested in the institutions that kind of surround me, but it just seems like there is literally not a single person covering them from a conservative point of view. You've got the Baltimore Sun, you've got the Baltimore Banner. There are a couple other blogs, local politics blogs that exist in the state of Maryland, but none of them, in my view, give fair representation to conservative views. So I just try to write what I see from my own point of view, and that was really the impetus. There were some stories that I saw happening that weren't getting covered, or stories that did get covered by the legacy media, but through a lens that I thought was unfair. So I just write what I myself would want to read, but doesn't seem to exist.
Okay, give us one example of a recent story that you've covered.
A recent story that I've covered, one that kind of went mini viral just here recently, was when an individual in Carroll County, who was the chair of the Moms for Liberty organization, she's the chair of the Carroll County division of Moms for Liberty, she went down to Florida for their national conference, the Moms for Liberty conference. Ron DeSantis was there, Allie Beth Stuckey was there. It was kind of a big deal, and she won a Joyful Warrior Award, which goes to an individual who exhibited, real spirit and courage, and just kind of fighting for the liberty and the freedoms of children. And exhibited some happiness and joy and a willingness to, work with the other side and those that they don't always agree with. And that's I think, just the perfect example of the kind of story that is a real local news story, but that the local news just, either won't cover or like doesn't really know how to cover, right? Like Moms for Liberty is a new organization. I think it's only a year and a half old, even if that. And these newer institutions, I just don't think the legacy media knows how to cover them. They just don't know how to approach them. So I saw that happening, and I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a great story. It's a wonderful award. It should be something that more people are aware of. But again, I just knew that the Carroll County Times, in this particular case, A, probably wouldn't be aware of the story, B, probably wouldn't cover it because they just don't really even know how to comprehend Moms for Liberty, and C, I would think that honestly the constituents in the audience that are kind of interested in Moms for Liberty in this area are basically skeptical of the Carroll County Times. So I just that's a very recent one that I saw, and in about 2 hours just kind of crunched together a quick article, and it did pretty well on Facebook and the local community. So that's one. I've done some like longer investigative reports. Like for example, at Salisbury University, my alma mater, there was a big controversy over graffiti that was discovered on campus. It was kind of like racially charged and sexually insensitive and very just basically gross and immature. But it kind of prompted what I think you could accurately call an anti-racist sort of revolution throughout the campus and throughout the administration. They did everything from holding therapy type sessions to reviewing the curriculum to insourcing a chief diversity and equity and inclusion officer, fundamentally changed the university. And it turned out that the perpetrator, it was a hoax. It was a complete hoax. It was a 54-year-old person of color, an individual with no connection to the university. And again, it was a hoax. It wasn't an actually legitimately racist incident. It was none of those things, but it prompted a sort of, again, I think it's fair to call it a mini revolution inside the campus that changed the university forever in a way that I think is for the negative. And nobody told the story. Nobody covered the story. And if you Google to this day, Salisbury University, racist graffiti, or anything along those lines, you'll just see a litany, hundreds of links probably from everything from the Washington Post to WBOC and the local media outlets down there. But nobody really bothered to kind of go back and correct the record or to tell the story in a way that I thought was truthful and accurate. So being that I was close to that institution, I kind of followed the story just out of interest more than anything else from the time it started to when it was revealed that the perpetrator, was really just a hoax, and then to the media's coverage, and even the university's reaction to the revelation that the individual was a person of color after the fact. And I just thought that nobody kind of wove the story together in a truthful way. So I wrote it myself and sent it to a bunch of my friends who were alumni and other people that are affiliated with the university, and it got some, really good response, really good feedback.
I would certainly use that as an argument of why our viewers should tune in to the Maryland Muckraker as you see the stories all the way through and go beyond what the mainstream media is telling us. So, once again, tell our viewers how they can find the Maryland Muckraker.
mdmuckraker.com. If you just Google search or Yahoo search or DuckDuckGo search Maryland Muckraker, it should pop right up. And Facebook is also the main social media channel.
You're watching Maryland Politics here on TV Free Baltimore.